Hello everybody, welcome back to Cinema Savvy. It is myself, George, bringing you a brand new review. And today I'm going to be reviewing The Pacific, of course, the 2010 miniseries that aired on HBO in the States and on Sky here in the United Kingdom. Series, of course, that we're looking at in respect to Masters of the Air, which finally starts broadcasting next Friday. I am, of course, doing this a weekly review. Last week I spoke about Band of Brothers. This week I'm going to be talking about The Pacific. It's going to be a very different conversation, actually, I think, compared to last week. Very different circumstances, different series. Of course, almost under... They're almost like sister shows in their own way. They're not really related, but of course they are. You look at the production, who's involved, Hanks, Spielberg, Gertz, and many others. So it's going to be an interesting one to dive into. I have rewatched the whole series. I say rewatched the whole series. I'll be talking about this very briefly, but this was the first time I'd seen it in full. I was thinking back to when it first came out. I've been trying to sort of rewind the memory clocks quite a bit, and I think I actually only saw the first 7 or 8 episodes of the show, which is really strange that I never went back to it. Maybe there's a reason as to why, which I'll find out as I talk about it a little bit more, but I'm going to be trying to segregate the story. It's very different to Band of Brothers, but before I do that, I do want to hear from people at home. So please do comment your thoughts on The Pacific. If you remember watching this when it first came out, if you've rewatched it since, what your thoughts are on it, how does it hold up? Is it unfairly compared to Band of Brothers all the time? That's a question I'm going to probably be answering at some point in the video. And of course, let us know your thoughts on Masters of the Air. Are you excited to see it? Who are you excited to see in that series? The cast is stacked for those that don't already know who's in it. But without talking anymore, let's talk The Pacific. And as I mentioned, first experiences with this series, I remember it coming out. It was a massive ordeal. We didn't have Sky. I was gutted. No joke. I remember it. I'm going to be really honest. I'm not going to lie about it. It's 2010. It's Call of Duty era. I'm like 14 years old at this point. World War was my favourite COD game. It still is. I played it a lot at school. There's going to be another World War II series. It gets you in the mood. You think of stuff like Call of Duty when you think of things such as this. And it's a really interesting timing for this series to be made in 2010. If you think about it as such, you've had Band of Brothers in 2001, this in 2010, Masters of the Air in 2023. Almost 3 different generations of acting, I'm going to call it. I know it's early to be talking Masters of the Air, but if you look at the cast, who's involved for each of the 3 series, Band of Brothers, I spoke at length about how the cast have gone through so much, how you've got these massive names and these really small roles that have gone on to have these careers in the 20 plus years. Pacific, of course, is 2010, so it's of course it's had a few more years since. It's more of the American cast. It's talking about the war, obviously, of the Pacific front on the islands, and I think it's had a very different legacy to Band of Brothers. Now, production-wise, this isn't based directly on a novel such as Band of Brothers. It's not just telling the story of one company, as Band of Brothers also did. And this is where I'm going to start talking about this question. It's hard not to think of Band of Brothers watching this show. It's hard not to compare to it, draw allusions to it. It's still HBO. It's 10 episodes. It's a mini-series. And to its credit, because it has had the budget, a $200 million budget, making it, once again, like Band of Brothers, the most expensive miniseries ever made at the time of production. I don't know if Masters of the Air is going to get that record just because of how obscene streaming budgets have decided to get in the last couple of years. But leading into this, I remember rewatching Band of Brothers. I remember, as I mentioned, playing Call of Duty a lot. I remember this at school. The advertising campaigns were massive. Hans Zimmer was attached to do the soundtrack, which I was at this point in my life getting into scores and such as that. And for whatever reason, I didn't click with it. And that's why I'm saying I never finished it. I remember a young Rami Malek being in it, only because I watched I can't remember the name of the sitcom, but it used to be on E4 back in the day when we were younger. And I knew him from that, A Night at the Museum. So Rami Malek was obviously completely different now. We'll be talking about Joseph Mazzale later as well, but it's a very different scenario to Band of Brothers. And it's tricky not talking about it, but I didn't gravitate to the series on the first watch as much as I thought I would. And maybe there's a bit of real life history with respect to that as to why, and I'm going to try and talk about that ever so briefly, but I want to talk about a couple of other things first. So, of course I mentioned it's released in 2010, not necessarily based off a book. This is still telling the story of 3, I'd say mainly 3 soldiers through the Pacific War, and each of those soldiers respectively has had books written about them, some by themselves, some by others. And it's tricky to think about this because I think with Band of Brothers, you have the attachment that you go with them in training, you get to know the squad, you then follow them out onto D-Day through Normandy, and you follow them throughout the entirety of the war. Whereas with this one, there's a lot of jumping between countries, jumping between the characters, the leads. And I will say this on the rewatch, it's still very tricky to not to care about these characters, because that's not what I'm trying to say. It's of course based off real life, it's historical, there's a lot of historical accuracy as you would expect with something such as this, but it's not done in that same level. And I wonder back in 2010 if people maybe thought the same thing, that one of the questions that no one really seems to know unless you know your history is why, aside from obviously the Japan attacking Pearl Harbor, what was the point of the war on the islands? What was it needed for, etc., etc. And as somebody that hasn't done this since history at school, it did make me go back to thinking. I was like, okay, so why did they need to go on the islands? Obviously, we know why. But the show doesn't really explain that. And a part of me thought it's a criticism. Then I was thinking to Band of Brothers that we all know D-Day. Everyone knows what D-Day is. We all know about the war on the European front. And maybe really it's a lack of knowledge outside of Europe on what happened on the islands, which are integral for not just how the war ended. Obviously, Oppenheimer's been out in the last year, which it still makes you think about, even in a show such as this, that you're seeing what these soldiers are going through, that the Americans wanted to end the war. Obviously, we don't get shown anything such as that, no mention of the nukes or anything, but it's really hard not to draw an eye to what's been out in the last year and some of the discussions surrounding, of course, not just World War II, but the moral choices of military, etc., etc., and the president. So it's a really interesting watch in the year 2024 now, I guess, sorry. And this is where I'm trying to sort of balance it out. I really enjoy following some of the lead soldiers and their stories. I think the problem is, once again, Band of Brothers, that we're following one squadron in their entirety, recruits coming in, new recruits, people going, people coming in, and we get a sense of, I know it's called Band of Brothers, but we have the brothership sense. And this is something that's missing in this series. But then if you go back to the Pacific War itself, if you actually look at the war, I don't want to talk about the Japanese army in a certain way. People know how ruthless they were, and this show is, I would say, more brutal than Band of Brothers when it needs to be. And a lot of what happened on those islands were a lot more brutal than actually you would get at times. Of course, the European front has the Holocaust and it has the death camps, which is one of the toughest episodes to get through, one of the most important episodes. But this series equally does a job at, once again, stripping out that Call of Duty's fun, exciting games, which I had a mentality of at that age, into almost looking into the horrors of war once more. Whereas this time, it's almost for survival. And it's a really weird way to talk about it, because we know how this story ends. But in this series, it's really tricky, because the first half, to me at least, is nowhere near as interesting as the second half. I mentioned when they're jumping between countries. We spend a couple of episodes of them on one of the islands. Then we're going to go back to Australia. Then we're going to go back to some more of the islands. Then we're going to go back. Then we're going to go forward again. And I think the show suffers due to that. After the opening titles on each episode, where the map will take us to where we are this week, it never really feels like we're getting not told anything, but it doesn't really feel like you're that connected, that you're watching almost for a history lesson more than anything. And I think that's a discredit to the series. I feel like I'm being really negative. I'm not, because it still has the incredible production values that Band of Brothers has there. I'm watching it because I enjoy history at school, and I'm not just excited for Mass of the Air. I enjoyed history at school. I enjoy, I guess you could say, war as a genre as much as you can enjoy something such as that. I like to learn more about real events and the historical side of things. So to hear the stories of 3 different people throughout their time on the Pacific Islands is quite touching, and it's very different to what we've had before. But ultimately, if a character goes who you've spent a lot of time with that you enjoy, or you're spending time with somebody else who you don't align with as much, it's tricky to have that connection towards them, and the show suffers as a result. So I think everybody's thoughts are entirely dependent on the characters leading episodes. I'm going to talk about James Badge, who I think is very good in the series. But with Lackey, I never cared for him, which is really horrible. I like the stuff at the end with him in his final episode after the war's finished, but I never particularly cared for him in the early parts, which is also unfair. You get a young John Berthon in this. John Berthon's meant to be playing a 20-year-old in his late 30s. And as like Band of Brothers, names will pop up of people that have gone on to have massive careers since this came out. Joe Mazzalo is another one I mentioned, Rami Malek, and the fact those two not only share scenes in this, but of course go on to be in Bohemian Rhapsody with one another, I thought was sort of amusing in a very strange way. Two completely different film and series, obviously, but there's something about the Pacific which for me just doesn't click as well as Band of Brothers. And I think that's the problem, is that it lives in the shadow of Band of Brothers. And it's going to be impossible for, I think, any show to get out of that. Even Masters of the Air, it's always going to be compared to those two. And that's telling a different story. They're all telling different stories from one another. So in my head, that's a me problem. That's not a problem of the show. But I think at times it's hard for the show to move past that, to move around that. What I will say with this series is the second half is so much, I don't want to say better than the first half. Once we get to Iwo Jima, and maybe it's one of the more well-known battles of the war, when we're once again seeing the brutalities, but also you're at the point in the war is you understand why they are needing to take these places. Again, if you don't know the real life side of things, I'm curious as to how it'd be tricky. If people honestly want my thoughts, the Pacific Island stuff is sort of mad. The complexity of it is you almost have to, the Americans have to almost work their way up to Japan by taking the islands, then cut off supplies, put new airfields in, blah 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 blah. You can read into all that sorts of stuff, and knowing they've done all this, and then in the show obviously just says they've surrendered, done. We know they dropped 2 nuclear bombs, so it's really tricky. Whereas again, Band of Brothers, different story, different part of the war. You're seeing them going into the I can't remember what they call Hitler's location at the end, but we're seeing the end of the war, the impact on them as the squad, and it feels well earned that you felt like you spent 3 years with them across World War II, from training through to the end. Whereas of this, it feels like you're picking and choosing each week, and bar 1 or 2 characters, I'd feel like it's a genuine struggle to connect as much, and that's kind of unfair on this, because some of what happened in the Pacific is far more brutal than what happened on European mainland, especially if you look at the armies, how different they functioned. Again, look at Japanese history and their approach during the wars and stuff. So it's a really tough one to talk about. The more I spoke this review, the tougher this review is actually being for me. And I kind of implied to the Band of Brothers that we might do like a 10 episode, you could do an episode each week on it. You absolutely could. Whereas with the Pacific, I don't ever feel like you could do that. I know they released a companion book before the series came out, written by the author's son who wrote Band of Brothers, which I always find a bit odd. At least with Masters of the Air, we know it's based off a book that was already out way before it became a series, so it almost feels forced. Like, we did the European war front, now let's do the Pacific. And that's where I feel like it got to. It's not a discredit to the production. I can't fault the production values. You know what you're going to get. You know you're going to get an incredible score. You're going to get brutal action set pieces. You're going to get some of the best looking and best sounding TV you're ever going to get. HBO, once again, absolutely nailing it. But you get to the end of episode 10 and I finished it. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, finally, like, I've done it. And it never felt like a chore, but it didn't feel as entertaining or rewarding as the first one, and it's hard to get past that. Someone's going to be saying take a shot every time he says Band of Brothers. It's really hard not to talk about Band of Brothers, and I think maybe there's a reason the Pacific isn't held up in the same category when people speak of these. Maybe it's because of what happened on the Pacific Island. Maybe, if I'll be honest, I'd have liked to have seen them explore a little bit more of that end of the war, rather than opening episode of they've surrendered. Of course, we know they did that, and I'm not here to sound like a conspiracy theorist or anything at all like that, but you can read into why the Japanese surrendered. It wasn't just the nuclear bombs. You can actually read into what happened before the bombs went off, that there was already talk of it, that the Russians declared that they would be going to war. You can read up on this stuff, so I don't think the Pacific really nails down what it was doing on the islands for you to then care, because each week it felt like, here's new island, here's new thing, and let's get them going and let's get it taken. It's going to be tough, but they're going to do it, and it's so repetitive. But as I said, the Iwo Jima stuff is the sort of peak of that. We know it's one of the most brutal parts of World War II, and the series again builds up to that very well, and it has some of the toughest scenes. And what I will also say is that the best thing about this series, I'm not picking the best episode, but by a country mile, some of the best stuff is the latter, probably episodes, I'd say like 7 to 9. I mentioned Iwo Jima already, but when we're seeing the mental impact that this war is having on the soldiers that were so desperate to join up and fight for their country, who begin saying they want to kill Japs, by the end of it they're like, oh no, we don't want to do that, why are people wanting to do that? To see the psychological toll it's took on them, to see what happens to the innocence of people in the war, the civilians, how they're treated, what happens to them, that's the most important thing from the series, I think, is the what happens to the mind on the war front. And that's something Band of Brothers didn't get to do as well, but this series did do this better. But again, it's that psychological, this is what happened in the Pacific versus what did happen in mainland Europe, and it's a weird way to talk about the series. It sounds like I've been negative. I've not been meaning to be negative. I still very much enjoy the show. I still think it's top tier TV. I still think it's a great HBO series. People should watch it. I just don't think it has that impact that others do. And as I said, there are the moments where it delivers, but as an episode of 10, as 10 episodes, I don't think it does it as well as others. And if someone says you're going to rewatch one of the two, yeah, everyone knows what they're going to say. They're going to rewatch Band of Brothers, aren't they? So it's a really awkward way to end a review such as this, to build up for Mass of the Air. I mentioned Mass of the Air review is going to come out next Wednesday at 2 p.m. That's when its embargo lifts. I'd be very lucky that I'd have had the whole series. I would have seen that in advance. I know I'm very fortunate to be in this situation. I've not watched an episode at the time of recording this. I'm doing it one by one. So that's going to go up 2 p.m. next week, completely spoiler free. As spoiler free as you can make a real life historical series. But at the same time, I'm very excited to watch it, and I still enjoyed this. So please comment your thoughts on the Pacific. If you think I'm being harsh, if you think I'm being fair, I do want to know people's thoughts on this. And as I said, I know I'm putting it next to Band of Brothers, which is very tricky for any series to ever do, but it is because it is that same production, the same environment, the same producers, etc. So that's going to round out this review. It's going to round out building up to Masters of the Air. Maybe there'll be a Masters of the Air discussion once it's finished, once all 10 episodes are out. Maybe we'll do a big discussion, bring on some more people, we'll try and do some other stuff, because I don't want to stop talking about these. It's a lot of investment as well into a 10-hour series for a 20-minute review, but that is going to do it for this one. There's a lot more happening on the channel. We've had a review out for the Creative 4K UHD earlier this week. We've had a discussion on the Emmy Awards. We've got some new releases coming out in the next couple of weeks. We're building up to Oscars. It's award season. I mentioned Mass of the Air. Any and all videos, we'll put them all over our social media. So go get us on linktree.com/cinemasavvy. A link to Redbubble in the description. But once again, thank you all for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Take care.